All right, so welcome back. This is our first lesson of Chapter 4, a chapter that's really a continuation of Chapter 3. Chapter 3 was a chapter that looked at the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And Chapter 4 is now talking about Canada's collective rights. The purpose of this lesson, or lecture, is not to duplicate what we've already seen from the Williams social videos or from the textbooks. So I would definitely encourage you to take a look at both of those, as they are excellent resources in and of themselves. But I'd like to also offer an overview of some of the key ideas and talk to you about some of the significant things we're going to be looking at. So to begin with, one of the takeaways from this chapter is the concept of collective rights. So we do need you, before we can unpack this concept too much, need you to recognize what are collective rights here in Canada. So in Canada we have individual rights, but we also have collective rights. And collective rights are rights held by Canadians who belong to one of several groups in society. They are recognized and protected by Canada's Constitution. There's something about that group that the Canadian government has made a promise, a commitment to protecting that group. So, for example, we will look at the Francophones, and the Francophone Canadians, the Québécois that speak French, and other Francophones across the nation are really surrounded by an ocean of people speaking predominantly English. And we have made a commitment as a bilingual country to protect that part of our heritage. And therefore, they have their rights put into place in the Constitution. So why do only some people have collective rights? Collective rights recognize the founding peoples of Canada. Canada wouldn't exist today without the contribution of these peoples. So many new Canadians, and we're getting about 300,000 new Canadians a year, many new Canadians may look at the collective rights in the Constitution and be a little confused as to why they're not being recognized. They are not a part of the founding story of Canada. So as the demographics of Canada change, as the cultural makeup of this country changes, there may be pressure to re-examine our collective rights. There is a potential that in the future, those groups that are seen as the founding members of Canada may become minority groups within Canada. And if the British, French, and Canada's Indigenous peoples, including the Métis, become minorities within Canada, then our collective rights may be re-examined. So, just an interesting note as a precursor to our next chapter on immigration. So who holds collective rights in Canada? Well, I mentioned Aboriginal peoples, including First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people in Canada. We have the Francophones, the Anglophones. So the founding groups that created Canada. Now, a part of our creation story as a nation would be our First Nations collective rights as outlined in a series of numbered treaties. We need to unpack that a little bit further. So for example, we've seen this medal. These medals are struck to commemorate the numbered treaties. This medal dates from 1874, and the images are meant to convey a very specific message. And what was that message? Looking at clues within the photograph. So this photo, this medal, the depiction on it has been used on multiple choice in the past, because we really want you to understand that the medal itself is conveying a very specific message about the relationship between the two people. Looking at the medal that you can see on the board there, what kind of relationship do you see? This is meant to commemorate the numbered treaties that we have here in Canada. So looking at the medal, do you see one group dominant over the other? The medal is meant to show two equals. They're on equal footing, meeting as partners in a new enterprise that will become Canada. It's not about one group submitting to the other. It's not about one group dominating the other, but unfortunately, as a consequence of these numbered treaties, that will be the legacy. So the original spirit of the treaties will be betrayed by those who end up ignoring the fact that the treaties were negotiated between equals, and rather try to use the treaties as an opportunity to assimilate and colonize. So we do have 11 numbered treaties signed between 1871 and 1921 as the Canadian government began to pursue settlement, farming, and resource development. So the question could be asked, why would the federal government sign treaties? Why would they sign treaties with Canada's Aboriginal peoples? Well, because they wanted to be able to pursue settlement, farming, and resource development in the West, in the North, in an environment that is as secure as possible. So our province of Alberta, is created in 1905. And it's created as a consequence of treaties that have been signed that made this area safe to settle. So these numbered treaties, what was the purpose of them? So that the federal government could settle, farm, and develop the resources in Canada's territories, including this, which was once the Northwest Territory and just became Alberta eventually. The terms of the treaties differed, but in most cases, First Nations agreed to share their land and resources in exchange for certain conditions like education, hunting, fishing rights, and reserves, farming assistance, and annuities. So here, we often hear about certain rights that people have, treaty rights. And different treaties will have different lists, but these are types of rights that are common to most treaties. So why do some people get to go bull hunting times of the year when others don't? Well, it might be their treaty right. For example, in Treaty 7, in Treaty 7 land, Treaty 7 made provisions for 1 square mile of land for every Indian family, plus a limited supply of cattle, some farm equipment, 1 plow for each band, and a small amount of treaty money. The treaty also made limited commitments. Oh, that went by way too fast. The treaty also made limited commitments on the part of the Queen to provide education for children. This will no doubt lead to some controversy, because this condition within the treaty will lead to assimilation through residential schools. There'll also be mentioning of land set aside for the exclusive use of First Nations, and this would be what a reserve is. This map shows the location of First Nation reserves in Alberta, and you can see some of the tribal identifications attached to those reserves. I'm not going to do the assignment, but it is interesting to note some of the numbered treaty territories in Canada. And it's also interesting to note where there aren't any treaties. So British Columbia has a lot of Indigenous peoples living on the West Coast that didn't negotiate a treaty. So this has contributed to some constitutional crises in BC. You can see the province of Quebec, which would like to separate from Canada, has a number of Indigenous peoples that live basically north of this little area around the St. Lawrence. And there is no treaty governing their relationship with the Quebecois or with the federal government. Interesting to also note is the lack of treaties signed around the area where Canada's majority of our population lives. So down here in the Golden Horseshoe, areas like Hamilton, Toronto, Montreal, no treaties there, no treaties in Ottawa. So this area where the majority of our population lives, no treaties, but they signed treaties in the West and in the North so that they could begin to settle and extract resources from it. So being that they had an agenda, that's where they pushed the treaties to. Both the Canadian government, wow, that goes by way too fast. Both the Canadian government and the First Nations had their own reasons for signing. So we've talked about firstly we talked about the government's reasons. But why would Canada's First Nations, why would our Indigenous peoples, our Aboriginal peoples sign these? Well, they had little choice in the sense that their traditional lives have been disrupted. So what you're seeing here is some of the graphic pictures that illustrate the very targeted destruction of Canada's traditional lifestyle by destroying the buffalo, by destroying millions of buffalo for the sake of just killing them. The federal government initiated a program that forced Canada's Indigenous peoples to sign the treaties in an attempt to save their way of life. So the eradication of the buffalo meant social and economic upheaval for some First Nation peoples, and they saw the treaties as an attempt to secure a future not for their children, but for their children's children. The treaties were seen as the only way to stop this madness that was destroying their lives. So once the treaties are signed, then we'll start settling Canada's west, and you'll see some advertisements like these trying to encourage people to move to the west and promising settlers different things. Interesting to note, had Canada not settled the west when we did, we would be no doubt living in the United States right now. This area would have been coveted by the U.S. shortly after 1867 if settlers hadn't moved in. And if this was the United States, elective rights of Canada's Indigenous peoples would not be protected under the U.S. Constitution. BC had joined Confederation on the condition that Canada would build a railway within 10 years to link the province with the rest of Canada. The railway was allowed a large number of immigrants to migrate to Canada's west in hopes of a better life that they had promised land by the government. Both these issues required that Canada obtain land. So how do you make a railway from Ottawa, from Toronto to Vancouver? You're going to go through Indigenous territory. How do you get the right? How do you secure that land from these First Nations tribes? Well, we're going to have to sign some treaties. So signing the treaties was also to help get BC to join Canada. These are just some illustrations from the time of some of the struggles that Canada's Indigenous peoples were having that forced them to think of signing the treaty. Things like smallpox and epidemics had taken a horrible toll on the First Nations, both socially, economically, psychologically, and therefore, again, the treaties were seen as some kind of a way to secure a future for their children and their children's children. So both First Nations and Canada's government wanted to avoid wars over territory, like the wars happening in the United States. So in the United States, the American government and the American military went to war with the Sioux. They went to war with the Creek. They went to war with the tribes of the West. And they destroyed them. They annihilated them. And Canada's government didn't have a taste for war. They didn't have a taste for bloodletting. So instead of going to war, they decided to negotiate diplomatically some way that they could share the land. So two different approaches for sure. There's just some questions to ponder. We're not going to do the group activity because of our pandemic circumstances. We do have a number of visuals here at the end, though, that help us really connect to the process. So for example, Treaty 6 has a provision for healthcare. One clause allows a medicine chest to be kept in the Indian agent's home for the use and benefit of the First Nations people. Some people felt that this provision extended to everyone who signed the number of treaties. Others went so far as to later interpret this provision as an eternal province by the government to provide free health care. So the language of the treaties has been re-examined multiple times. And this created some different viewpoints as to what actually happened when these treaties were signed. So here's a reflection during the negotiation of Treaty 6, which you should be taking an interest in, living here in Wetaskiwin. Things like, we are brothers, we will lift you up, we will teach you. There is an essence of ethnocentrism there, and white man's burden, the idea that I have something that you need, and there is a sense of paternalism. But in brotherhood, there is a bond that is meant to be about love and compassion and empathy and cooperation. And unfortunately, we are not far removed from the legacies of residential schools in our area, in our province, in our country. And as we can see here from this quote from 1879, the purpose of residential schools. Aggressive civilization is just another way to say assimilation. Right here shows that although they had signed a treaty just years before, and in some places we're still in that process of signing treaties, their real agenda was assimilation. You can see an aspect of assimilation in this quote as well. Need to make the Indians lead the normal life. The normal life. So there's a lot of tone and value attachment saying that, traditional life's not good enough. So even in 1946, there's already John Titusis, the Poundmaker Cree Nation, recognizing that some of the promises in the treaties had been broken. And by the 1960s, the buzzword was just society. Let's create a just society. We talked about just society in our last chapter. And in 1969, Canada cannot be a just society and keep discriminatory legislation on its statute book. The barriers created by special legislation such as treaties can generally be struck down. The treaties need to be reviewed to see how they can be equitably ended. So the goal here is to end the treaties. And that goal, attached to things like the white paper of the federal government, will create a backlash against the federal government by Canada's Indigenous peoples who are not willing to give up their collective rights. So one thing that we'll be seeing in the textbook is there's a number of agencies like the Indian Association of Alberta that will end up becoming the voice of the Indigenous peoples, the First Nations of that area. And the IAA, one of their objectives, one of their goals, was to lobby the government, the federal government, and to communicate the desires of Alberta's Indigenous peoples. And included in that would be just an understanding of the treaty, but also the federal government to acknowledge its obligations to them. Things in there that are worth noting are, fulfill the sacred obligation handed down to us by our forefathers for future generations. That the significance of the treaties was noteworthy for many who were tied to them. And this is a quote that we saw from Trudeau in that last unit, the last chapter. I speak of a Canada where men and women of Aboriginal ancestry, of French and British heritage, of the diverse cultures of the world, demonstrate the will to share this land in peace and justice and with mutual respect. said at the proclamation ceremony of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So, we're going to be revisiting the idea of residential schools this week and Francophone rights this week, and we'll be looking at alienation, not only just for the Indigenous peoples and the Quebec law, but for people out here in the West in general. So that's an introduction to the chapter, and I invite you to go back to your booklets. We have 20 minutes left of class. I invite you to go back to your booklets and get a little bit more work done.